Sometimes the ground remembers what people try to forget. The first night Ethan Cole slept in the house, the silence felt heavier than anything he had carried in years, heavier than the pack he once hauled across desert miles, heavier than the memories he never quite managed to leave behind. And as the cold crept through the warped wooden boards beneath him, he almost convinced himself that the place was just old, just tired, just another forgotten structure given away for less than the cost of a tank of gas. But Rex knew better, the 6-year-old German Shepherd lay near the foot of the bed, ears twitching at sounds too soft for human notice, his amber eyes open in the dark as if reading something written beneath the surface of the world. And it was sometime past midnight when it began, not a loud noise, not a crash or a creak, but a faint rhythm, so subtle Ethan barely registered it at first, a low pulse beneath the floorboards like a distant echo carried through miles of earth. He shifted under his worn blanket, exhaling slowly, telling himself it was just the house settling, just wood adjusting to the cold Vermont air. But then Rex lifted his head, sharply, precisely, like a switch had been flipped inside him. His ears stood tall, angled toward the floor rather than the door, and a low sound formed in his chest, not quite a growl, not fear, something more focused, more deliberate. Ethan turned his head on the thin pillow, watching the outline of the dog in the dim silver light spilling through the window. "Easy, boy," he murmured, voice rough with sleep and habit. But Rex didn't relax. Instead he stood, slow and controlled, paused silent against the creaking boards, moving to a spot near the corner of the room where the wood darkened with age. And there he stopped, staring, listening. And then it came again, the pulse, faint but steady, and Rex answered it. 3 short barks, spaced evenly, almost like he was responding to something calling from below. Ethan pushed himself upright, heart beating a little. Faster now, not from fear, but from a feeling he couldn't quite name, the kind of instinct that had kept him alive more times than he cared to count. He swung, his legs over the side of the bed, boots scraping lightly as they met the floor, the wood cold even through the worn soles. "What is it?" he asked quietly, though he knew Rex couldn't answer in words. The dog tapped one paw against the same spot, once, then again, then lowered his head, pressing his ear flat against the boards, listening with a kind of patience that felt almost human. Ethan stood and crossed the room, each step releasing a soft complaint from the aging structure. The air carried that dry, dusty scent of long-abandoned places, mixed with something else now, something metallic, faint but real. He crouched beside Rex and placed his hand flat against the floor. At first there was nothing, just cold wood and silence. But then, as he held still, he felt it, a vibration, so slight it could have been his imagination, yet too steady to ignore, a soft, repeating tremor like a heartbeat buried beneath layers of time. Ethan's breath slowed as he counted without thinking, the old habit returning. 1, 2, 3, 27. And there it was again, the same pulse, perfectly spaced, perfectly consistent. He glanced at Rex, whose eyes were now fixed on him, not questioning, not afraid, but certain, as if the dog had already decided this mattered, as if whatever lay beneath them had been waiting to be heard. And for the first time since he'd stepped inside the house, Ethan felt something shift inside him, not fear, not curiosity alone, but recognition, the quiet, undeniable sense that this place was not as empty as it seemed, and that Rex had heard the truth long before he ever could. The rhythm did not stop when he stood up. It waited, as if it had all the time in the world, and that was what unsettled Ethan the most, not the sound itself but the patience behind it. The way it returned every 27 seconds with the same quiet certainty. He kept his palm pressed against the floor longer this time, feeling the faint tremor travel through the wood into his bones. And somewhere in the back of his mind an old memory stirred, not fully formed, just a fragment of training, of waiting, of listening for something hidden beneath what looked ordinary. Rex shifted beside him and gave a soft huff through his nose, then tapped the same spot again, slower now, more deliberate, as if urging Ethan to pay closer attention. "All right," Ethan said under his breath, his voice steady but lower than before. "I hear it." And the words felt heavier than they should have, like an acknowledgement of something larger than a simple noise. He stood and moved toward his pack resting against the far wall, the canvas worn and faded from years of use. Inside, he found a small flashlight, its metal casing scratched but reliable. He clicked it on, and a narrow beam of light cut through the dim room, dust drifting lazily in the air like suspended time. When he returned to the corner, Rex stepped back just enough to give him space. But his eyes never left the floor. Ethan crouched again and studied the boards more carefully now, the grain of the wood, the way one plank sat slightly uneven compared to the rest. It was subtle, something most people would have ignored, but once seen it could not be unseen. He ran his fingers along the edge and felt the difference, a faint gap where the board did not quite meet the next. The pulse came again beneath his hand, steady, patient, waiting. He exhaled slowly and pressed down on the plank. Nothing happened at first, just the familiar resistance of old wood. But when he shifted his weight and pushed near the edge, there was a soft, hollow sound. Deeper than the rest of the floor, Rex's ears lifted higher at that, his body leaning forward with quiet intensity. Ethan reached for the small pry tool in his pack, hesitating only for a moment before sliding it into the narrow seam. The metal scraped softly against the wood, the sound echoing more than it should have in the silent room. He applied gentle pressure, and the board lifted just slightly, enough to confirm what he already suspected. Beneath it was empty space. Not the solid foundation he expected, but something else, something hidden. Rex let out a low sound. Again, not fear, not warning, but recognition, as if this was exactly what he had been trying to show him all along. Ethan worked the tool carefully, easing the plank upward inch by inch until it finally gave way with a quiet creak. He set it aside and angled the flashlight down into the opening. The beam revealed darkness at first, thick and undisturbed. Then slowly shapes began to form. The edge of something metallic, smooth and deliberate, not part of the original structure. A hatch, old but intact, its surface marked with faint lines that hinted at purpose rather than decay. Ethan felt the air shift slightly. A cooler current rising from below, carrying that same metallic scent stronger now. And as he knelt there, staring into the narrow opening, he realized something that settled deep in his chest with quiet certainty. This was not just a forgotten space beneath an old house. This was something placed here, something meant to be found, and Rex, standing beside him in perfect stillness, had known exactly where to look long before the first board ever moved. The metal surface beneath the floor did not reflect the light the way ordinary objects did. Instead, it seemed to absorb it, dull and steady, like something built for purpose rather than comfort. Ethan lowered himself closer to the opening, angling the flashlight to trace the edges of the hatch. It was set perfectly into the space below, not forced, not improvised, but installed with precision, the kind he had only seen in places where mistakes were not allowed. His fingers hovered over the surface before finally touching it, cold even through the thin layer of dust, and beneath that cold there was something else, a faint vibration that matched the rhythm he had been counting, steady, unchanging, as if whatever lay beyond that hatch had its own sense of time. Rex shifted beside him and let out a soft whine, not fearful but insistent, his nose dipping toward the opening and then lifting again as if catching a scent that did not belong to the present. Ethan glanced at him, reading the tension in the dog's posture, the way his muscles stayed coiled yet controlled. "You remember something, do not you?" he murmured, though he was not sure whether he meant the dog or himself. The thought lingered longer than it should have, because there was something about this moment that felt familiar in a way he could not explain, like a memory just out of reach. He shook it off and focused on the hatch again, running the beam of the flashlight across its surface until it caught on a small indentation near the edge, not quite a handle, more like a recessed grip designed to sit flush. He slid his fingers into it and paused, listening. The pulse came again beneath his hand, calm and exact, and for a second he hesitated, not out of fear but out of respect for whatever had been left hidden here. Then he pulled. The hatch resisted at first, sealed by years of stillness, but with a steady effort it shifted, releasing a low sound that echoed deeper than the room above should have allowed, the kind of sound that seemed to travel downward rather than up, as if it was waking something below. A thin current of air rose from the opening, cooler now, carrying that same metallic trace mixed with something older, something like dry stone and forgotten space. Ethan lifted the hatch fully and leaned back slightly, letting the beam of light fall into the darkness beneath. This time the shapes came into view more clearly, a narrow ladder fixed to the wall, descending into a space that extended farther than the house itself suggested it could. The walls below were not wood but reinforced panels, smooth and pale, catching the light in muted lines, and the pulse, the steady rhythm, was stronger now, not louder but more present. Like standing closer to a heartbeat that never faltered, Rex stepped forward again, placing one paw at the edge of the opening. Then looking back at Ethan with that same steady gaze, not urging, not demanding, but waiting, Ethan exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs in a controlled breath he had learned long ago, his mind settling into a quiet focus that pushed everything else aside. The past, the questions, the doubt, all of it fading into the background, replaced by a single, simple understanding. Whatever this was, it had been hidden for a reason, and whatever reason had brought him here, it had not been chance. He adjusted the flashlight in his grip and shifted closer to the ladder, the beam stretching downward into the unknown, the pulse continuing its measured rhythm. Beneath it all, steady as time itself, and as he placed his boot on the first rung, Rex moved beside him without hesitation, as if the path ahead was not something to fear, but something they had been meant to find together. The ladder held firm beneath his weight, each rung cold and unyielding as Ethan descended slowly, one step at a time, the beam of his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness below, the air growing cooler with every foot he dropped, shifting from the dry stillness of the cabin into something deeper, older, a space untouched by wind or sunlight. Rex followed without hesitation, his paws moving with quiet precision, nails barely making a sound against the metal as if he had done this before, or at least understood that this place demanded silence. The pulse continued, steady and exact, no louder than before yet impossible to ignore now that they were closer. It seemed to live in the walls themselves, traveling through the reinforced panels that surrounded them. And as Ethan reached the bottom of the ladder, his boots met a solid floor that echoed faintly under his weight, not hollow like the wood above, but dense, deliberate, the kind of construction built to endure. He lifted the light and let it sweep across the room, revealing a narrow corridor extending several yards ahead, its walls lined with smooth metal surfaces broken only by seams and faint markings worn by time. There was no dust here, no decay in the usual sense, only a stillness that felt preserved rather than abandoned, like a place waiting rather than forgotten. Rex stepped forward first, his head low, ears forward, his body moving with that same focused awareness Ethan had seen countless times. In the field, not fear, not caution alone, but recognition of something that mattered. Ethan followed, his breathing steady, his senses sharpening as the corridor stretched before them. The light revealed details slowly. A conduit running along one wall, a panel set into the surface at waist height, its edges outlined by a thin layer of grime that suggested it had not been touched in years. Yet nothing here felt broken, nothing felt random. The pulse came again, and this time, Ethan felt it through the soles of his boots, a faint vibration rising from beneath the floor and into his chest, aligning with his own heartbeat until for a moment he could not tell where one ended and the other began. He paused, closing his eyes briefly, listening not just with his ears, but with that instinct he had learned to trust, the same instinct that had guided him through places where logic fell short. And in that quiet second something shifted in his memory, not a full recollection, but a sensation, a familiarity with the rhythm, the spacing, the purpose behind it. His eyes opened again, and he looked down the corridor with renewed focus. Rex had stopped a few feet ahead, standing beside a door set flush into the wall, its outline barely visible except where the metal met metal in a perfect seam. The dog glanced back once, his amber eyes catching the light, steady and certain. As if to say this was where the trail ended or perhaps where it truly began, Ethan approached. Slowly, the beam of the flashlight settling on the door's surface, revealing faint symbols etched into the metal, not decorative, not random, but functional, precise, and something about them stirred that same quiet recognition inside him, like a language he had once known but could not yet fully remember. The pulse echoed again, closer now, stronger in presence if not in sound. And as Ethan reached out, his hand hovering just inches from the door, he realized that whatever lay beyond it was not just hidden, it had been waiting for someone who would understand when to listen, and perhaps more importantly, when to finally open it. The moment his fingers touched the metal, something shifted, not in the room but within the silence itself, as if the space had been waiting for that exact contact. The pulse beneath his feet held steady, yet felt closer now, more present, like it had acknowledged him in return. Ethan pressed his palm flat against the door, feeling the cold surface, the faint vibration threading through it in perfect rhythm. And for a brief second he hesitated, not out of fear but out of respect, because whatever lay beyond this door was not accidental. It had been designed, prepared, and left behind with intention. Rex stood beside him without making a sound, his body still but alert, his gaze fixed on the door as if he could already see through it. Ethan drew a slow breath and applied pressure. At first nothing happened. The door held firm, unmoving, but then there was a subtle shift, a quiet release from within the mechanism, almost too soft to hear, yet unmistakable. The seam along the edge widened by a fraction of an inch, and with a steady push the door opened inward, revealing a room that seemed untouched by time. The beam of his flashlight swept across it slowly, revealing smooth walls, a narrow table fixed to one side, and a series of panels embedded along the far wall, their surfaces dim but intact. Nothing was broken, nothing was scattered, everything remained exactly where it had been left, as if the room had been sealed in a moment and preserved ever since. The air inside carried a different weight, cooler and cleaner, with that same metallic trace now stronger, and beneath it all the pulse continued, not coming from the walls this time, but from somewhere deeper within the room. Ethan stepped inside, his boots making a muted sound against the solid floor. Rex followed immediately, his head low as he moved forward with quiet certainty. Stopping near the center of the room, where the vibration felt strongest, he lowered himself slightly, pressing one paw against the ground just as he had done upstairs, then looked back at Ethan. The same signal, the same insistence. Ethan moved closer, angling the light downward, and that was when he saw it. A circular panel set into the floor, almost perfectly flush, its edges marked by faint lines that formed a pattern too precise to be random. The pulse was coming from beneath it, steady as before, unwavering. He knelt down, brushing his fingers across the surface, clearing away a thin layer of dust that revealed a small recessed section at the center. Not a handle, not a latch, but something more deliberate, something that required recognition rather than force. His breath slowed as he studied it, and again that strange familiarity surfaced, like a memory just beyond reach. Rex let out a soft sound, almost a whisper of a whine, and Ethan glanced at him, then back at the panel, the connection forming not in logic but in instinct. He placed his hand over the recessed section, aligning his fingers without fully knowing why, and for a brief moment nothing happened. Then the pulse changed, not in rhythm but in depth, as if it had responded to his presence. A faint click echoed beneath his palm, followed by a low hum that spread outward through the floor. The circular panel shifted slightly, just enough to reveal that it was not fixed but meant to move. Ethan leaned back slightly, watching as the edges separated with quiet precision. The mechanism smoothed despite the years, and as the panel slowly opened, revealing darkness below, deeper and more concealed than the space they had just entered, Ethan felt that same quiet certainty settle in his chest once more. This was not something he had stumbled upon. This was something he had been led to, step by step, sound by sound, until there was nowhere left to go but forward. And beside him, Rex stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the opening, as if he had known from the very beginning that this was where the truth had been waiting all along. The darkness beneath the opening did not feel empty. It felt contained, as if whatever lay below had been sealed not to be forgotten, but to be protected. Ethan remained still for a moment, watching the circular panel settle into its fully open position, the edges locking quietly into place with a precision that spoke of careful design. The pulse continued, steady and patient, rising now from the space beneath like a quiet invitation rather than a warning. He leaned forward and directed the beam of his flashlight downward, revealing a second descent, narrower than the first. Not a ladder this time, but a set of built-in steps carved directly into the structure. each one evenly spaced, leading into a chamber that extended beyond the reach of the light. The walls below were smoother, more refined, and there was something about the symmetry of the construction that made it feel intentional in a way that went beyond simple function. Rex moved closer, his head lowering toward the opening, nostrils flaring slightly as he drew in the air. Then he looked back at Ethan again, the same calm certainty in his gaze, not urging, not hesitant, simply present, as if he trusted that Ethan would understand when the moment was right. Ethan adjusted his grip on the flashlight and shifted his weight forward, placing his boot carefully onto the first step. The material beneath him felt solid, unyielding, and as he descended the temperature dropped slightly, the air becoming cooler but also clearer, carrying a faint scent that reminded him of old equipment, clean metal, and something else he could not quite name, something familiar yet distant. The pulse grew stronger with each step, not louder in sound but deeper in sensation, vibrating subtly through the structure and into his body until it felt less like an external rhythm and more like something syncing with him. He reached the bottom and stepped into the chamber, the beam of light expanding across. The space revealed a room unlike the one above, wider, more open, and centered around a single object placed with deliberate focus, a console of some kind, its surface smooth and curved, with faint lines of embedded panels that remained dim but intact. Nothing flickered, nothing sparked, yet everything felt ready, as if it had only been waiting for the right presence to return. Rex entered beside him, his movements slower now, more deliberate. He circled once before stopping directly in front of the console, sitting down with quiet discipline, his eyes fixed on it as if acknowledging something unseen. Ethan approached cautiously, his steps measured, his attention drawn to the center of the console where a small screen sat dark and still, framed by markings that echoed the same precise patterns he had seen before. He raised his hand toward it, hesitating only for a breath. Then, as his fingers hovered inches above the surface, the pulse shifted, not breaking its rhythm but deepening in tone, and the screen flickered softly to life, not bright, not sudden, but gradual, like something waking after a long and patient sleep. A faint glow spread across its surface, forming shapes that began to resolve into lines, then into symbols, and then into something unmistakable, a sequence, a message, not random, not foreign, but structured in a way that stirred something deep within him, something that did not feel new but remembered. And as Ethan stood there in the quiet glow, with Rex beside him unmoving and certain, he realized that whatever this place was, it had not simply been waiting for anyone. It had been waiting for him to finally see what had never truly been lost. The glow of the screen did not flicker like something unstable. It held steady, soft and deliberate, casting a pale light across Ethan's face and reflecting faintly in Rex's eyes. The symbols continued to shift slowly, forming lines that felt less like language and more like instruction, something meant to be understood, not just read. Ethan leaned closer without realizing it, his breath shallow, his focus narrowing until the rest of the room seemed to fall away, the pulse beneath his feet aligned again with the movement on the screen, each sequence appearing in perfect rhythm with the silent beat that had guided him here. And then, without warning, the shapes resolved into something clearer, not words exactly but patterns he recognized, coordinates, structural layouts, fragments of systems he had once worked with, long before he chose to forget. His hand lifted slightly, hovering near the surface, and as it did the display shifted again, responding not to touch but to presence. As if it could sense him, as if it had always been meant to, a faint sound followed, not mechanical, not digital, but something softer, like a recorded breath held too long and finally released. And then a voice began, low and steady, not loud enough to startle but impossible to ignore. It did not echo in the room so much as settle into it, as if it belonged there. "If you are seeing this, you made it back." The words were clear, measured, carrying a tone that felt both distant and familiar. Ethan's chest tightened slightly, not from fear but from recognition that had not yet reached the surface. The voice continued. "This station was sealed for one reason, not to hide what is here, but to preserve it, until it could be understood." The screen shifted again, displaying images now, faint outlines of the very structure he stood in, layered with data he did not consciously recall learning, yet somehow understood: diagrams of energy flow, timing sequences, systems designed to operate beyond the visible world above. Rex remained still beside him, his posture calm but attentive, his gaze fixed not on the screen but on Ethan, as if watching for the moment understanding would fully arrive. Memory is not always lost, the voice said softly. Sometimes it is set aside, waiting for the right signal to return. The pulse beneath Ethan's feet deepened again, no longer just a sensation but a presence, something that seemed to move through him rather than around him. And in that moment the fragments in his mind began to align, not as full memories but as impressions: late nights under dim lights, listening for patterns beneath concrete, learning to read what others could not hear, learning to trust the rhythm of things hidden below. His hand lowered slowly until his fingers brushed the surface of the console, and this time the response was immediate. The glow intensified slightly, not blinding, not overwhelming, just enough to confirm the connection. The voice softened as it continued. You were chosen because you listen. And something about those words settled deeper than anything else, not as a revelation but as a quiet truth he had always carried. Rex shifted then, placing his head gently against Ethan's leg, grounding him in the present. And as Ethan stood there in the soft light, surrounded by a system that seemed to know him better than he knew himself, he realized that this was never just about what was hidden beneath the floor. It was about what had been waiting within him, patient and silent, until the moment he was ready to hear it again. The words did not fade when the voice fell silent. They lingered in the air like something that had weight, something that settled into the space between breaths. Ethan kept his hand resting on the console, feeling the faint warmth now radiating from its surface, a subtle change from the cold metal he had touched before. And for the first time since entering the chamber, the pulse beneath his feet began to shift, not in timing but in character. It no longer felt like something distant or separate. It felt synchronized, as if it had adjusted itself to him rather than the other way around. The screen responded again, the symbols dissolving into clearer forms. Lines of structured information unfolding in layers that revealed not just the design of the chamber, but the purpose behind it. Maps appeared, not of roads or cities, but of signals, invisible pathways threading beneath the land, connecting places that should not have been connected, each point marked with precision, each interval timed with the same steady rhythm he had followed since the first moment Rex barked at the floor. Ethan's eyes moved slowly across the display, understanding arriving not in a sudden realization but in a quiet unfolding. This was not a single location. This was part of a network, something built to endure beyond the surface world, something that listened as much as it transmitted. The voice returned, softer now, almost reflective. What you found is not an ending. It is a continuation. The words settled deep, carrying a calm certainty that left no room for doubt. These stations were placed where the ground could hold memory, where time moves differently, where signals are not lost but preserved. Ethan exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling with a steadiness that matched the pulse around him. Fragments of thought aligned again. Training that had once felt fragmented now forming a clearer shape. Not just about listening, but about interpreting, about knowing when something hidden was not meant to be disturbed but understood. Rex shifted slightly beside him, his presence grounding, his quiet confidence unwavering. As if he had always known the path would lead here. The screen brightened just enough to reveal a final sequence. A set of coordinates centered on the very location they stood in, followed by a second set, then a third, each one extending outward like a map of possibility rather than direction. Ethan studied them, his mind no longer resisting the familiarity, the sense that he had been part of something larger than he had allowed himself to remember. The voice spoke once more, almost like a closing thought. You were never meant to carry it alone. And as those words settled, the room seemed to exhale, the pulse easing slightly, no longer demanding attention but offering presence. Ethan lowered his hand from the console, the glow dimming just enough to return the chamber to its quiet state. Yet nothing felt dormant. Nothing felt inactive. It felt awake in a different way, as if it no longer needed to call out because it had been heard. Rex leaned gently against his leg, a steady weight, warm and real, and Ethan rested his hand on the dog's head, fingers brushing through the familiar fur as he looked once more at the display, at the paths stretching beyond what he could see. And in that stillness he understood something that did not need explanation. This was not something he had uncovered by accident. This was something that had been waiting for him to remember how to listen, and now that he had, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt full of meaning, steady and patient, just like the pulse that had led him here. The room did not return to silence when the light dimmed. It settled into something deeper, a quiet that carried presence rather than absence. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his hand resting on Rex's head, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dog's breath, grounding him in something real while everything else shifted into place inside him. The console no longer called for attention, yet it did not feel abandoned. It felt complete, as if it had fulfilled its purpose simply by being understood. The pulse beneath the floor eased into the background, no longer demanding to be followed, only continuing as it always had, steady and patient. Ethan took a slow breath and let it out, his shoulders loosening in a way they had not in years, not because he had found answers, but because he no longer felt the need to chase them. He glanced once more at the faint glow of the display, at the network of paths stretching far beyond the walls of the chamber, and instead of questions, he felt recognition, a quiet acceptance that some things were not meant to be solved, only carried forward. Rex shifted slightly, pressing closer, his presence unchanged, unwavering, as if none of this surprised him, as if he had simply done what he had always done, led the way until Ethan was ready to see. "You heard it first," Ethan murmured softly, his voice calm, almost reflective, and Rex's ears flicked at the sound, but he did not move. He did not need to. Ethan turned slowly and looked back toward the steps, the path leading upward, the same path that had brought them down. It no longer felt like an escape or an exit. It felt like a continuation, a return with something new carried quietly beneath the surface. He took one last look at the chamber, at the console, at the place that had waited without urgency or demand. Then he stepped toward the stairs, his boots steady, his movements unhurried. Rex moved alongside him without hesitation, their rhythm aligned now in a way that needed no signal, no command, just understanding. They ascended together, step by step, the air growing warmer as they rose, the faint scent of old wood returning, the subtle creak of the cabin above waiting to greet them. And when Ethan finally reached the top, he paused at the opening, glancing back once into the darkness below, not to confirm what he had seen, but to acknowledge it. The circular panel remained open, the chamber below still and patient, as if it did not need to be closed, as if it trusted that what had been found would not be forgotten. Ethan stepped back onto the wooden floor, the familiar boards shifting slightly under his weight, yet they no longer felt hollow. They felt connected, part of something deeper he could now sense even without touching. Rex stepped up beside him and turned once before settling near the spot where it had all begun, his body relaxing for the first time since the night started, his head lowering onto his paws, his eyes half closed but still aware. Ethan replaced the loose plank carefully, not to hide what was beneath, but to respect it, to let it remain as it had been, present but unseen. He stood there in the quiet cabin, the early light of morning just beginning to touch the edges of the window, casting a pale glow across the room. And for the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel empty. It felt full, steady, alive in a way he could not explain but no longer needed to. He sat down slowly, leaning back against the wall, his eyes drifting toward Rex, who breathed evenly, calm and certain, and Ethan allowed himself a small, quiet exhale, the kind that carried weight away without needing to name it. Somewhere beneath the floor the pulse continued, unseen, unchanged, and he knew it would remain whether he listened or not. But now he understood that listening had never been about hearing something new. It had been about remembering what had always been there, waiting for the moment he was finally ready to notice. And as the light grew stronger and the day began to unfold above them, Ethan closed his eyes for just a moment, not to rest, but to hold on to the stillness. Because some truths did not need to be spoken, they only needed to be carried forward, quietly, the way they had always been meant to be.